You're listening to the UKC Hunting Ops Podcast, celebrating hunting dog heritage, competition, and community. United Kennel Club has been the hunting dog sports home for coonhounds, beagles, retrievers, pointers, cur, feist, and more for over 125 years.
Thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of the Hunting Ops Podcast. I'm Domenick Moyo. I'm the program manager for Hunt Test and Field Trials. And today I'm joined by Tony King, who is the current president of the AFTCA.
Thank you for having me, Domenick. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm really excited for this one because we kind of get to dive into what AFTCA is, some of its history, and I think a lot of our listeners are going to be able to benefit from this, especially the bunch of amateurs that run this sport.
Right. And I agree. I think there's, when you get into the sport of field trialing, you have a tendency to get active in your field trial club. You get active in running your dogs. You get active in training your dogs. But many field trialers don't have the opportunity to actually learn about or get involved with the national organizations that oversee or govern the sport of amateur field trialing. So I think this is actually a topic or a future podcast of the one that I'm currently working with the AFTCA. So I think this is great timing.
Yeah. And I know you guys are a few episodes in there, but it seemed like you did your first episode live at the national banquet a couple months ago, right?
Yeah. So I'm working with Steve Auksher, who's the trustee at large for marketing and communications of the AFTCA. And, we saw a direct need for content, YouTube content, podcast content to help promote and grow our sport. So we came up with this crazy idea, got it by the trustees, and they're supporting it. And the podcast that we started is actually called The Dog and Pony Show. And we named it that because, what better way for horseback field trialing, what better name for horseback field trialing? But we did do our first episode at the Purina Awards, and it was more of a Facebook Live episode. And we had, when you do these things, you have learning curves. We had some audio issues. It was loud. Some of the interviews didn't work out. So here recently, we conducted our second podcast with Mark McLean and Stephen Stacy Croy, and Mark was the Purina All-Age Handler of the Year, and Stephen Stacy had the Purina, All-Age Dog of the Year. And what we did was wanted to go back and re-interview those guys because our interview with them, the audio was not usable. So, yeah, it went well. We launched it today. And we're kind of studying the analytics and looking at everything, and we're analyzing what we did and what we can do better. So it's exciting. It really is. And I never thought at 51 years old that I would be involved in a podcast.
Well, that's the neat thing about podcasts is they're gaining so much traction in so many different venues, and it's a good way to convey information to people, especially those who travel a ton, like our field trial community. Being able to just plug on a podcast and listen on your drive gives you something to do, and it's a way to help you absorb some information and continue to learn and find ways to improve.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Mark shared, and when you listen to Mark's side of the podcast, one of the things we always want to do is try, when we interview a pro handler, a guy that does it for a living, I always want to try to grab tidbits of information from them that can help the amateur, the working amateur field trialer that has limited time to do what they love. So Mark shared some tips and tricks on roading and feeding and heat tolerance. And some of that content that he shared was absolute gold. It was great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always fun getting to talk with different pros and and glean a little bit from them, even if it's not on dog training. Like you said, it's you can find a good bit of dog husbandry, I guess, information as well.
Absolutely.
Now, I kind of want to dig into AFTCA specifically here.
Okay.
I'm really curious. I'd like to hear, when did the AFTCA start, and what was the catalyst for establishing it?
Yeah. So, I'm not considered an in-depth historian on the sport of field trialing, but I've done some research. And when you and I talking about this subject, I look back and actually, if you go to aftca.org, the AFTCA website, there's a great article written by Barbara Tier, and it was basically highlighting the century point, the 100-year mark for the AFTCA. The AFTCA I believe they held their first meeting in 1917. And what was happening in the early 1900s is the sport of field trialing was growing. There was a definite transition from professional plantation handlers to just standard dog hunting owners that wanted to, compete in the sport of field trialing. And as amateur competition kind of cobbled itself together and local amateurs with bird dogs got together and started running and competing, there was a definite need to develop kind of a coalition of clubs or a group of individuals to help facilitate and manage the sport of field trialing. So, 1917, I think there was 5 clubs that were involved in the pioneering of the amateur field trial clubs of America. And the article that is on the AFTCA website goes, describes its inception, how it got started, and the running of the first national amateur championship. And then it transitions into basically looking at the second championship, that national amateur championship that was developed, and so on and so forth. So, the AFTCA has been an evolving organization since 1917, going from a coalition of clubs that realized the need for organization and management to becoming a 501c3 corporation and developing standards and bylaws and overseeing the sport of amateur field trialing.
Yeah, and you said you started with 5 clubs. Do you have a rough number on what we're looking at now?
A rough number of clubs, I think we're looking somewhere, and I may be light on this, but I think we're looking somewhere around 300 active clubs.
Hmm.
The AFTCA is comprised of 17 active regions throughout the United States. I think we have 25 or 26 active AFTCA trustees involved with the AFTCA, and I think we have roughly 1,500 individual members currently.
Oh wow! So a lot of growth over the last 100+ years. I think something that some people don't realize about the AFTCA is their overall importance when it comes to things like the American field trial rules, the running rules. And so for those who don't know, the American field has always maintained their own requirements and minimum standards for field trials, but AFTCA has set their running rules overall for the amateurs, and American Field adopts those as well for
Correct.
the open side.
Correct.
And so, Tony, can you speak to a little bit to the rules process and how these rules are brought about, and why they are so applicable throughout the sport?
Well, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is the AFTCA has developed, several important, not only their bylaws, how they operate their corporate charter, but their running rules and regulations. And I think we have to keep in mind that these running rules and regulations were designed and developed by individuals not only on the open side, but on the amateur side. They collaborated together. So these rules and regulations were designed to be broad based and encompass the entire sport of field trialing. So it was easy actually for the Field Dog Stud Book American Field to say, hey, you guys have this covered. We will adopt those standards and those running rules and allow them to be applicable across the board. Another thing that's important, in the sport of field trialing for folks that new guys that are getting into the sport of field trialing, I would recommend to every new field trialer to read, and I maybe I can get this on camera, the standards to field trial procedures, judicial practice, handler and bird dog performance. And this document itself, published by the AFTCA, was also written by many prominent open and amateur handlers at that time. And this is another document that is adopted by the American field, produced by, individuals on both sides of the platform, but has stood the test of time and applies to all situations within field trialing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to think how it's a collaborative effort through the amateur field trialing club, and how it's really stood the test of time. I mean, there's
Right.
not been a whole lot of revisions or changes needed to be made to it over the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important is there's really not a representative management body for open handlers. There's no open handlers coalition or anything like that. So I think when they were designing and developing these judicial practices, standards, and the methods to field trial procedures, they realized that our forefathers of field trialing realized that, and they made it so broad based that it covered the entire sport. And the neat thing to me is, like you say, they had so much forward thinking that these practices have stood the test of time and have lasted as, our society and has changed over the years.
Yeah, I mean, general practices, world processes. I mean, they're writing these rules long before the the
Right.
first set of
Right.
locator collars are starting to come out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was trying to look here to kind of get, I think 1948, a committee of members of the AFTCA started working on the standards of judicial practice and field trial procedure. So, you're talking what, post World War One into World War II time frame. So, wow, it's really neat.
Yeah, I'm not a great historian on technology, but do you think they had any sort of telemetry back then, or do you think they might have had those long tone-based antenna things?
No, I think the telemetry they had back then was a guy on a horse chasing a bird dog down to get him corrected when he knocked a covey of birds. That's and a flushing whip. I think that was their long range telemetry.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of my favorite parts about this sport is how timeless it is. So many practices and so much tradition is rooted in the history. And even when you look at the rules, they're still practiced today the same way they were, back in the 40s.
Yeah. I think it's important. Dominic, you have had the opportunity to sit in on a couple of our closed door AFTCA meetings, as a guest. And I think you have got the opportunity to realize that, the tradition, the heritage, the trustees of the AFTCA realize its importance, realize how to preserve it, protect it, but they also realize our sport's evolving, our membership's evolving, our thought processes are evolving, the different ways we train dogs, all that's evolving. So there are ways for us to tweak and adapt with the ever-changing times to, make it, to benefit the sport.
Yeah, while retaining the rich history that's rooted in it.
Correct.
Yeah. That's one of those things that even if you go to a weekend field trial, like I go to Hoffman whenever I get the chance and there's a trial going on, and you step into the headquarters building, and I mean, you're seeing old black and white photos. And it's like this history just washes over you. And you sit down for lunch and you talk with these guys. And you hear so much about the history, about the tradition, and who helped establish this or that, or yeah, that's the guy that got me into field trialing. And they can point to a picture on the wall. And I mean, you're talking about these guys that are long since retired and they're still enjoying their time on a horse, but they're talking about back when they were in their 20s and they got into field trial, and that black and white picture up on the wall, that's the guy that he set me up with my first bird dog.
Right.
And so
I think and that is one neat thing about our sport is it's not once somebody gets in, competes, gives their bird dog the opportunity to either compete in a walking trial or a horseback trial. They borrow a horse. They feel the presence of that nostalgia, and they hear the conversations on the back of a tailgate at a field trialer from an old field trialer or 3 or 4 that can't ride anymore, but they come sit on a tailgate or ride in the dog wagon and tell stories about the bird dogs of the past and the bird dogs of the future. And it's one of the huge drawing cards to our sport that's hard to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but once you're in it, it's one of those things that helps keep you in it.
It is. When we were interviewing the Croys the other day, I believe it was Stacy sent me a meme, and it said that it's harder. It's easier to get out of the mafia than it is to get out of bird dogs. And there's never been a truer statement,
Yeah. Well, hey, that kind of brings about the question for the guys that are listening, that maybe they're starting to have interest in American field, or they want to know how to get involved in it. How do we get them in that mafia from the president of the AFTCA standpoint? How can we help them join AFTCA and get involved in bird dogging?
I think, and we, one of the things that we're doing right now is one of the easiest pathways that we can take to show our sport, and to the different generation of kids that may like outdoor activities, that may never had a father or an uncle or a grandfather that took them bird hunting, but may want to bird hunt. So, I think content creation, bridging that gap with the generation of kids, teenagers, young adults, 30 and 40-year-olds that learn everything from their iPhone. I think once you can, if they have a bird dog, we need everybody. And I think if we can bridge that generational gap, we can produce and provide content on YouTube, on social media that shows what our sport is, what it does, and how competitive and challenging and rewarding. And I think that direction will help us draw new membership, because we're a small enough group now that just inviting cousin Bob and his nephew Bill, and maybe one of those two may latch on, stick with their bird dog, is becoming harder and harder. I think, and I've talked to the AFTCA executive board about this, and I think they agree with me, that we have to reach out and expand our advertising and expand our focus, and we have to build our brand, build the AFTCA brand, build the field trial brand, and show the 3.7 million YouTube subscribers what a field trial is and what a field trial does.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, put us in the scenario. I hear this episode. I take the bait. I say I'm getting into field trials. I'm an amateur. What benefit does it have for me to join AFTCA? Why can't I just go to open trials or the amateur trials without being a member?
Well, the AFTCA is a sanctioning body for amateur field trials. So quite simply, if you want an AFTCA win certificate, if you want to utilize the AFTCA resources, you have to be a member of the AFTCA to receive your AFTCA win certificates, to be part of the amateur sport of field trialing. And I think it's hard. We have a $50 membership. I think until you get involved and realize what the AFTCA does for the sport of field trialing, it's hard to understand why it's important to be a member. In 2022, a couple years ago, Domenick, we had this very discussion. Mark Johnson, Franklin Ass, and myself said, it's hard for us to sell the AFTCA brand if people don't know exactly what the AFTCA does for the sport of field trialing. So it's kind of like joining. If you want to run in a shoot to retrieve trial, you got to join the NSTRA. If you want to be part of the American Barrel Horse Association, you have to join that association. It's very similar with the AFTCA. When Mark and Frank and I sat down and we produced a document called "What Does AFTCA Do for the Sport of Field Trialing?" It's on the AFTCA.org, and it's a 14-point bulletin document that gives bullet points as to what we do, the AFTCA does, from our land tax credit program to our 20th Century Fund program that gives back to amateur field trial clubs. And now, with the creation of the Purina Event sponsorship program, so it helps new members understand that what the AFTCA does for the sport of field trialing.
Sure. And you kind of touched on it there. There's a couple of different scholarship and funds going on to continue to support the sport of field trialing for future generations. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit more on how that's benefiting some of the future of the sport?
Yeah. So primarily, I think back in the mid-1980s, the 20th Century Fund was developed, which is a fund that was created from endowments or donations. And basically, this is an investment fund to where the AFTCA utilizes the interest from those funds and takes those monies and gives back to field trial clubs across the country. Each year, the AFTCA field trial clubs all over the United States apply for 20th Century Fund monies. And the AFTCA reviews those applications and awards anywhere from $18,000 to $20,000 a year and gives back to field trial clubs across the country. So amateur field trialers can go to these venues. It's a venue promotion. It enhances upland game bird habitat. It enhances the venue that you go run your dog at. It improves wildlife and habitat management. So it's one of those things that it's kind of a seen thing, but it's not really understood. And and another thing that's done is our land tax credit program. And it was a program established 4 or 5 years ago. I think David Williams was one of the primary collaborators of that program. And what it does is it allows a tax credit program for landowners who allow field trial clubs to run and participate or run field trials on their property. So it's kind of a unique program. And
Yeah,
then there's also another program, and I think we're that's currently under development. And I think if you remember right from this summer's meeting, we're trying to form a committee and put together a committee to develop a youth scholarship program, and hopefully we'll be working with the Youth Field Trial Alliance on that. And I'm working to try to establish right now current committee members to chair and head that committee.
Yeah, and there's a huge youth initiative right now across the sport, and I think it's much needed and maybe a little bit overdue, but better late than never to get the younger generation involved in field trialing. And so I think those sorts of initiatives are so beneficial for the sport, not just the amateur side, but the open side as well. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. A couple of those handlers down in Alabama, some of those youth handlers, and they are so good that they can do anything they want with their life, but they'd be such a successful pro one day if they wanted to be. And so it benefits both sides of the sport to engage in the youth side and recruitment.
Yeah, the interesting thing about field trialers from the participant side of things, you meet people in the sport of field trialing from all walks of life. So there is a certain level of networking that goes on across the board throughout the United States of field trialers that you've met, that you've developed relationships with. And I think as we bring children to these field trialers, throw them up on a horse or let them walk beside the handler, let them run their dogs. They not only learn social skills, they learn networking skills from the people that they meet. Plus, they learn to compete, and they learn the ethics of working hard and trying to train your bird dog better, giving them a goal to set towards. I want my dog to be a champion someday, Dad. Well, we got to go work. We got to go train more. So field trialing, is not only a competitive sport, but it's also kind of a lifestyle sport that you can bring your children to, and they can learn so many facets of life at.
With Eukanuba, stamina is the one difference I'm seeing. When I'm running hair up north, my dogs will put on 10, 12, 15 miles of solid running, and they just don't tire as easily or as quickly. Oftentimes, my work schedule does not allow me to have the desired physical conditioning on my dogs, but even then, as many as 25 or more miles a day of hard running is just another day in the office. To me, it's been apparent Eukanuba's 30-20 sport formula is making that difference. Eukanuba, the official performance dog nutrition partner of UKC.
Now, one thing I do kind of want to touch base with you on is, president of the AFTCA, at one point you were that new amateur to the sport. What insight or what advice would you give to those newer guys that are tuning in because they just got their start in field trialing? What's your advice to them?
My advice to every new field trialer, once you're involved and once you decide, hey, I want to be a member of the MBHA, or I want to be a member of the Central Missouri Bird Dog Club, I would say, first and foremost, become an active member of a field trial club, which means participating in hosting a field trial event, anywhere from cooking meals to competing, to planning birds, to managing the funds, doing anything and everything involved with running a field trial. Then I would say get involved with your amateur regional, your region, your AFTCA region. Try to become an officer if you so do wish, and then once you get involved and become a member of those organizations, I feel it leads to the thought process of, hey, I understand what it takes to put on a field trial. I understand where the sport is, and oh, by the way, I need to work on these programs with my field trial club or with my regional organization or with the AFTCA national organization to help grow and promote the sport. So my advice to every new field trialer is get involved with an active field trial club. Don't just go and participate and go home, with your ribbon or your trophy. Get involved with that field trial club. Get involved on a regional level. Get involved on a national level. Get involved in something that helps promote and grow the sport.
Yeah, that's great advice. And as we start to wrap up here, what would you say to someone who knew nothing about American field that could help encompass the whole sport, help them understand what this sport's all about?
That is probably probably the hardest question you're going to ask me to address today. And I want to point you to an article, and maybe all organizations can use this article. I was thinking about this, Domenick. How do I describe to someone to get involved that owns a bird dog that is just a quail hunter to get involved in the sport of field trialing? My pathway was I wanted to extend my bird hunting season, so I competed in the shoot to retrieve. When I started competing in shoot to retrieve, I took the American Field magazine. I became enamored with the stories of the great dogs, field trial dogs in the American Field magazine, and wanted to go to a horseback field trial. At that time, I was managing a hunting lodge in central Illinois. So, and we had a bed and breakfast, we had horses. So I was pretty good on a horse. So I wanted to go to a horseback field trial and learn about it. So I went from, bird hunter, hunting guide to shoot to retrieve to MBHA walking trial when I bought a pup from a guy that invited me to come, running dogs in the MBHA, becoming actively involved in its futurity program and its officers, to eventually transitioning into the horseback shooting dog world, and now to the AFTCA. For the common everyday bird hunter that's looking for a way to extend their season, I don't care if it's shoot to retrieve, I don't care if it's MBHA walking, I recommend go get involved, see what field trialers are about. Now, the article I was just talking about, I stumbled upon, was an article written by Ben Brettensen. Do you know him? He's with Onyx. And I hope, Ben, if you're listening, I said your name right. Anyway, he wrote an article in Gun Dog called Understanding Pointing Dog Field Trials. And anybody listening to this, go back to the February issue of Gun Dog magazine and read about his experience as a bird hunter, getting involved in a walking trial and breaking down the differences in walking, shooting dog, all age, and their comparisons. And his article is one of the best published articles that I've read that explains what field trialing is all about. And it also addresses some of the misunderstood things in regards to, a field trial dog is just a runoff. You can't have take a field trial dog bird hunting. So I thought his articles addressed some of the issues that we have in linking the bird hunter field trial bridge. So I would recommend to anybody listening, go back to the February, I think it was 2024 issue of Gun Dog and read that article. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I might get off this call and go try to put my hands on it.
Yeah, I'll be happy. I'll send you a link when I get back to the office, Domenick, because I was thinking about that question, and I was saying, man, how am I going to explain this besides, field trialing was designed to be an extension of the hunting season. For some people, early on in the early 1900s, it was the plantation owners and the property owners bragging on who had the best gun dog and their hunting party handlers competing to see which one was the best. But, bird hunters can bring their dogs and compete in field trials and be successful. And we want them to be part of field trials. We want them to be part of the Amateur Field Trial Clubs of America. we need everybody to be part of this sport that we all love.
Hey, that brings up a great point about, the history of it a little bit. Riding along, I've gotten to hear some pretty cool stories, and they talk about how field trials, the current format of a field trial, is so rooted in old school plantation owners going to their plantation in the fall, wander, hunt some birds, and going to the guys that they had training their dogs all year, to the point that the judges represent the land and dog owners, and your handlers represent the guys who have been training them all year. And that's why when they're sitting there singing and that dog makes a nice pass right along a stand of woods or something that they want to make sure the judges see, they're pointing it out. Hey, just like they did back then. Hey, there's your dog. There's your dog way up there. And it's still rooted in the unproductives. After your dog has so many unproductives, even if they're having a good run, you don't want that owner to see, oh, why does this dog keep pointing at nothing?
Right.
And so that's why, they're picking dogs up. And that field trial truly is rooted in, being as close to what old bird hunting on a plantation used to be.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And if you think about it, and I can't remember what book I was reading that talked about Hobart Ames, the owner of Ames Plantation, about him judging field trials. Can you imagine a group of plantation owners, 3 or 4 of those guys sitting on a horseback, judging their dog men and arguing about which dog was best and how much, money was going to exchange hands on the bet? But yeah, you're exactly right. That certain things that we do today represent historical practices, of bird hunting. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah. And you mentioned the land trust thing. That's the last thing I want to touch on, because some of our coonhound guys, they've got access. They're not going to be running too much trials in an open pasture or some of that big acreage that they might have on some of these grounds. So maybe a little bit of osmosis of resources here. But how can some of the farmers who might be involved in, say, the coonhound side of the house here get involved with helping field trialers utilize some of their open grasslands and farmland?
Yeah, the land tax credit program. Now, I don't know how it could cross pollinate specifically into the coon hunting world, but I think that a similar program, if copied or developed to mimic what our program does through the AFTCA, I see no reason why the coon hunting world cannot adopt a similar program or develop a similar program, because I know Rick Peterson, David Williams, and a specific committee of AFTCA trustees were involved in the research behind this, not only from the legal side and the IRS side when they checked into this to say, hey, is this something we can do? And we've been operating this land tax credit program for several years. So in the coon hunting world, if you have large landowners or small landowners that are allowing a competition to use their ground, there may be, now I give no tax advice. I do not work for the IRS. I have no knowledge in that. There may be an opportunity to research our program, what we're doing, and potentially utilize it on your side, and vice versa from our side of things. I have looked at some of the coonhound programs that you guys are doing in regards. Don't you guys do sort of a champion of champions? Doesn't the coonhound world do a champion of champions type event?
Yeah, they've got their tournament of champions, and,
right?
Worlds and all of those events.
And I've looked at some of those type of competitions and said, it'd kind of be neat to maybe possibly put together a format that brought all amateur, national amateur champion and runner-ups and regional champion and runner-ups to one event and do a tournament of champions field trial on the amateur side of things, I think that type of a format promotes diversity, across the country, and would be something that we should look at for kind of a neat venue. And this was an idea that kind of, you're hearing it first on your podcast, that we've kind of been kicking around the bushes here, and that idea came from kind of watching a YouTube video in the coonhound world. So I think both worlds can collaborate together and learn from each other to get things they need to grow.
Yeah. And it's funny too. Like I said, I've been down at Hoffman and at some other trials, and when I talk to guys about dogs, the number of guys who have told me before they got into pointers, they ran UKC coonhound trials.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the segue was or what the pipeline is, but it's funny that there's a good bit of like cross-pollination going on between competitors as well at least at some point in history.
I'm not name dropping, but I know Scott Miller, who was big in the National Bird Hunters Association many years ago. But Scott was big into competitive coon dogs, and there are a lot of field trialers that have had coon dogs and been involved in it. My wife bench showed coonhounds for many years, and I had a Grand Night champion female. So it's a small world. We're all dog people. We love dogs and we love competition. So, there's a reason why both worlds can get along, and you can go back and forth between the two.
That's right. Well, hey, Tony, I really appreciate you taking the time to hop on the podcast here. And I hope this discussion helps open people's eyes to what the AFTCA is and understand what they do for the sport of field trialing. And, hopefully we continue to see these upward trends in membership and participation and help keep this historic sport going for another 120 years.
I think the opportunity is there, Domenick. It's not going to come without work. It's not going to come without, changing some of the historical things that we did and evolving to the new generation of people and kids that we have, and adapting to the way people learn nowadays versus how they learned back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It can be done, but we need to roll up our sleeves and go to work and help grow this sport we all love.
That's right. Well, thank you again for taking the time to be on here, and we hope you guys listening enjoyed this episode.
Thank you for having us, Domenick. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Alan, I know we both have new Dogtra Pathfinder 2s. How are you liking yours so far?
I'm liking it. I've even had the opportunity now to use mine where I didn't have service, where I download the map of that area, and it works flawlessly. Love it.
I agree. I really like my Dogtra Pathfinder 2 as well. I've used it quite a bit the past few months. I really like the crystal clear maps. I like that it doesn't lose service very much, and I don't have many bad things to say about it at all. Dogtra Pathfinder 2, the official GPS collar partner of UKC. Thank you for listening to the UKC Hunting Ops Podcast. Be sure to give us a follow so you don't miss any of our new episodes or content.